Hey guys, in this video we're going to be tracing the pathways for your peripheral nervous system, specifically your sensory and your motor pathways. In this picture, your lateral gray horns is responsible for your autonomic nervous system, but to make the video shorter, I decided that I will just make that on a separate video. So the circle that you're seeing here on the screen with the red Among Us figure looking thing in the middle, that's basically a cross section of your thoracic vertebra, which is like this. But this is way too complicated to draw, so if you guys would like to do this on the exam, that's too much. Just draw something like this. So we're gonna label these in a little bit, but first let's talk about directional terms. So anything on this top half, that is your posterior. Anything on this bottom half, this is your anterior. So I'm going to go label those real quick. Posterior, anterior. So sensory is the hardest, so we're going to start with that. So anything here is always sensory. However, for sensory, we will find out later that it also does the posterior and the anterior ramus. But for now, just know that everything on the back of your vertebra is always sensory. So because sensory is like you feeling things, you receiving information, what that is information coming from your PNS to your CNS. This is what you call afferent, because information is arriving from your PNS to your CNS. I need to go on Do Not Disturb because these notifications are insane. All right. And then anything on the front is always motor. Because for you to do things, you have to think of it first, specifically like your skeletal muscles. Like if you want to move your arm, you want to kick something, you want to move your fingers, you have to kind of think of it to do it. So information is coming from your CNS to your PNS. This is information exiting your central nervous system, which is called efferent. So sensory, you feeling things, motor, you doing things. Let me just separate these two to make it more clear. Now for this video specifically, like I said, we're going to be ignoring the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to cross out the lateral gray horns. So to label these, this is your posterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, anterior gray horn, and anything that I'm drawing over right now, that is your white column. Now let's move on to the nerves coming out of your vertebra. So these two, this and this, these are called your posterior root. Now this big ball right here, this is your posterior root ganglion. I'm just going to do P root ganglion. And then this, we can assume that that's going to be your anterior root ganglion. Or excuse me, anterior root. Sorry, my dog is playing outside of my room and it's distracting because it's so loud. And then this thing in the middle, this is your spinal nerve. I think this is optional if you want to include it for your test answer. But don't quote me on that. I would just put it just to be safe. And then these two sticking out, these are your posterior and anterior ramus. Now going back to the ramuses, again, for sensory, it's always going to be on the posterior end of your vertebra. However, when we get to the ramuses, it's either posterior or anterior. Sensory does both. So for posterior, the way you can identify if it's your posterior ramus or your anterior ramus is anything that you feel on your back is always going to be posterior. Meanwhile, anything that you feel on anywhere else of your body, including limbs, that's not your back, that's your anterior ramus. And then for your motor senses, for the motor pathway, it's always only going to be the anterior ramus. So I hope that makes sense. So we're going to start with the sensory examples. So we're going to start with, let's say you're walking at a park and a baseball hits you on your back. So let's put that real quick. So for me personally, the easiest way for me to tell if it's sensory or motor is if you're feeling things, it's sensory. If you're doing something, it's motor. So the way how I can tell this is sensory is you're getting hit and on your back. Now, the fact that it's on our back, this is a key word. This tells us which ramus we're starting with. But now for sensory and motor, I'm not sure if you have to include the muscle. I'm pretty sure muscle and nerve that it innervates, or excuse me, the nerves and then the muscle that it innervates, that's only for motor. But just to be safe, we're going to start with the receptor, the skin, whatever, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so because we know we're feeling something, we know that this is sensory. And because it's hitting us on our back, we know that it's on the posterior ramus. However, just to be safe, and we want those extra points, this is how we're going to start it. And by the way, for most people, I know, like this girl in my class, for her, she likes to start like, oh, is it going from the PNS to CNS or CNS to PNS? That's one way to do it. I just know sensory is always PNS to CNS and motor is always CNS to PNS. Start how you want to start your questions, but for me specifically, I like to break down the problem. Like, am I doing the movement or am I the one being touched? So if I'm being touched, it's sensory because I'm feeling it, so I instantly know it's PNS to CNS. But the reason why I underlined back here is because, like I said, it's a keyword which will help us on this section. Anyways, so if a baseball is hitting us on our back, we're going to start with the receptor. What are the receptor? The pain receptor, because we're hurt from getting hit with the baseball. The pain receptor is called a nociceptor. So we're going to start with that. Next, the other receptor that gets activated is your mechanical receptor. Now to the muscle, I'm just going to say your rhomboid. Or you can say like your trapezius, latissimus dorsi, whatever. Next is the nerve, which I think on the back we don't have one specifically. So I'm just going to skip that part. So I don't think that part needs to be that specific. But anyways, now we're going to go on to the rhombuses, or excuse me, the ramuses. So which one here was the one that got activated? or the pathway where the signal was sent. Well, like we said earlier, since we were hit on the back, that tells us that the pathway for this event is going to start with the posterior ramus, just because it's always going to be sensations on your back. So this is the pathway. I'm just going to draw it out real quick. So it goes from here to here, goes through all this, then to the gray horn, then to the white column, then it goes from your spinal cord to your brain. And I'll draw that out in a little bit. Just to make it easy, I'm just going to draw a spinal cord and a brain. All right, so the muscle. Next, we're going to put the posterior ramus. Then it goes down to the spinal nerve. Then you can either put posterior root or the posterior root ganglion. It doesn't matter which one you want to start first in this section, as long as you include both. Because, like I said, technically, this is also your posterior root, but this is also a posterior root. So whichever one of these two you want to start with, doesn't matter, same thing. I'm just going to start with the posterior root ganglion because that's how I remember it from memory. Posterior root gang. Next step is your posterior root. Then, now we're going on to the the posterior gray horn. And how that information is sent from your vertebra up to the brain is through the white column. Think of it as an elevator. For sensory information. Now this is the next important part. Once we get to the white column, and now we're going up to the brain. For sensory specifically, you guys have to know that before anything else goes to your brain, it has to go to a particular part of the brain that does sensory relay, which is the thalamus. So that's the 9th step. And then the last step is your post-central gyrus, which is your primary somatosensory cortex. If you just put somatosensory, Professor Tiffany will take that too. Just post-central gyrus, somatosensory. You don't have to do primary somatosensory cortex, primary sensory cortex. That's too much stuff. Just put somatosensory next to post-central gyrus and you'll get the point. I think for this one, if you're ever going to skip a step, you can probably skip the muscle, just because we didn't study any nerves on the back. So how are you going to know which muscle it innervates? So step 2 is probably the only thing that you can skip here, but this is basically the pathway from PNS to CNS. The post-central gyrus, that's the brain part. The receptors, that's on the surface of your skin. And your receptors, your PNS, I meant. What am I saying? Hopefully that makes sense. So that's sensory. Now, if you get hit on your leg, on your arm, anywhere on your chest, if it's anywhere else that's not your back, that's how you know it's anterior ramus. So the same pathway for everything except the ramus right here. So if you get hit on your arm, your leg, any limb, anywhere in front of your body besides your back, the only thing you would change here is from posterior ramus, you'll change it to your anterior ramus. That's literally it. That's the only thing you're changing. But for the most part, everything else is the exact same pathway-wise. Again, this is from your PNS to CNS. So if I say, you get kicked on your shins, you get kicked on your shins, the only thing that changes is anterior ramus. Now, if it's something that doesn't really hurt, I'm pretty sure it's optional to put the pain receptor, like nociceptor, but generally speaking, if you're feeling something, your mechanical receptors are always going to be activated. But if you're, experiencing pain or anything like that, then your nociceptors get activated. If Professor Tiffany decides to be weird and she's like, let's say you're putting, I don't know, sunscreen on your arm. If she wants to get that specific, then you would probably put like chemoreceptor, because you're feeling things like chemicals in your skin. I don't know. I don't want to confuse people, so I'm not gonna include that just because that's too confusing. But anyways, so that's the sensory part. Now we're gonna erase this and we're gonna do motor. So any motor movement is always going to be on your anterior vertebra. So let's say you want to kick a ball. So the action here is kick, and we're doing the movement. So we're going to start from the CNS to PNS. This is a lot simpler, if I'm being honest. This is my favorite, but I like sensory because it's hard. Anyways, so for motor, for you to kick a ball, you have to consciously think of kicking the ball. So we're going to start with the CNS, starting with the brain. The very, very, very first step is, if you want to get specific, you can say prefrontal cortex, because that's the part of your brain where you make decisions, critical thinking, all that stuff. But Professor Tiffany will take your precentral gyrus, which is your primary motor cortex. I like to put motor cortex next to it, just so that she knows I know what I'm talking about. Next, and most people get this confused, people typically put thalamus, but remember, your thalamus, its main function is sensory relay. Because we're not doing sensory, you don't put thalamus. That's only for sensory. Only for sensory, the thalamus. But for motor, you completely skip that part. The next step is we're going straight from the brain down to the vertebra, or the spinal cord right away. So we start from here, the frontal part of your brain, straight down to the spinal cord, which is the white column. Because what is the white column again? It's basically the elevator where information travels. So white column. Now, because this is motor, once the information exits the white column, it goes straight to the anterior gray horn. Here's the next step. And then once we get to the anterior gray horn, now we're going to go to the anterior root, then to the spinal nerve, then to the anterior ramus. For motor, we never have posterior ramus. It's always anterior ramus, just because nothing on your back you can move. Technically, you can move the muscles, like if you want to retract your scapula, the rhombus or rhomboid. Rhomboid, I meant rhomboid, not rhombus, what the heck. Your rhomboid. But that's way too deep, and that's going to be confusing. So just remember, because you can consciously control it, anything, anywhere on your body that's on the front and limbs, always anterior ramus. Just remember, motor is always anterior ramus. So this part is optional, but if you want, you can put spinal nerve after the... Oh, shoot, I completely forgot. I am so sorry. After the anterior horn, no wonder why I realized it felt like something was missing. After your anterior horn, then we go to the anterior root, which is right here. Spinal nerve, and then anterior ramus. Now, the next two steps are very, very important for the motor pathway. So because we're kicking a ball, after you put your anterior ramus, the next step is you have to put down the nerve, and then you also have to put down the muscle. So because we're kicking a ball, we can say sciatic nerve or the femoral nerve. I'm going to put both because the whole thing moves. Oh, you can also put the tibial nerve and the common tibular nerve. But I'm just going to put sciatic. Those 4 things that I mentioned, you can put those, but you can just pick one. And then for the muscle, I'm going to put down, let's say, actually no, I feel like sciatic nerve is kind of too complicated. I'm just going to put femoral nerve. And then because we're kicking, we can just put like rectus femoris for the muscle, just step 8. And then I don't know if she needs, or excuse me, I don't know if she wants the action too, but if she's gonna go that far, then you can just put for rectus femoris, you can put like knee extension. Because anything on the top half of your hips, anything that goes out front is flexion. Anything that goes on the back is extension. And then for hips below, anything that goes out front is extension. Anything that goes out back is flexion. So for this one, I'm just going to put knee extension. Because you're kicking ball. And then that's it. I hope this makes sense. Just to recap, anything for sensory is always going to be on the back, but once it gets to the ramus part, if it touches your back, always posterior. If it touches anywhere else on your body and your limbs, always anterior. For your motor pathway, it's always going to be at the front. For motor pathways specifically, do not forget the nerve, the muscle, and what type of movement, or excuse me, what type of action, just to play it safe. But for sensory, you don't have to do any of this, but make sure you put a receptor. Like, if you felt pain, put nociceptor. But because you're sensing things, always put mechanical receptor. Hopefully that makes sense. If anybody has any questions, feel free to message me in the Discord. That's all you guys have to know for the pathways for your peripheral nervous system.